Hello, everyone. I see we have quite a few attendees already, so we are going to go ahead and get started. Hello, and thank you very much for joining us today. Welcome to this session. My name is Srilata Sircar. I am lecturer in India and Global Affairs at the King's India Institute here in London, and also the convener of the Confronting Caste series, which we are launching today. This is going to be the first in a series of events that we are organizing through this academic year. The aim behind the series is to expand the scope of critical engagement with caste as a structure of social power in both historical and contemporary perspectives. This term, we have 3 exciting panel events planned. These will take place every alternate Thursday starting today. And we are also releasing a companion piece to the seminars in the form of a podcast in which I speak to researchers from various disciplines and geographies about their work on the everyday operations of caste power in different social contexts. So please do keep an eye on the King's India Institute website and social media handles to know more about these events and releases as they come up. For today's panel, we have a very exciting lineup of speakers. We have with us today Professor Bhuvaneswari Raman from the Jindal School of Government and Public Policy at the Jindal Global University. Today, Professor Raman will be speaking on the spatial practices of reinscribing caste in Indian cities. Thank you, Professor Raman, for joining us from India. I know it is quite late in the evening for you, and we appreciate you taking the time. We also have with us Dr. Kalaiyarasan A, who is a Fulbright Nehru Fellow at Brown University and Assistant Professor at the Madras Institute of Development Studies. His talk today will speak to the question of, does capital fight caste? Welcome, Kalai. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Srilata.
And finally, we have on the panel Dr. Malini Ranganathan, who is Associate Professor and Faculty Director of the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at the American University in Washington, D.C. Today, Dr. Ranganathan will speak on the outcast city, property segregation, and environmental unfreedoms in Bengaluru. Very warm welcome to you, Malini. Chairing the session today and acting as discussant, we have our very own Professor Christophe Jaffrelot, who is Avantha Chair and Professor of Indian Politics and Sociology at the King's India Institute. So with that brief introduction, I will hand it over to Christophe, who will introduce today's topic and get the panel started.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Srilata, for this initiative, a great initiative that you have taken immediately after joining King's, which is even more remarkable. For a long time, the way caste relates to space has been analyzed in the rural context only, in the village. For, you can say, decades, social scientists, mostly anthropologists, look at caste in the context of the village. And of course, urbanization, that is now a driving force in India, has forced us to look at caste in the urban context, and we have new questions to ask. And I'm glad you are offering responses. Does urbanization blurs caste barriers? Is it only in the big city that you can be anonymous caste-wise, or in smaller towns as well? And of course, is it something we see in each and every region of India or in the most caste-conscious ones? So we are very lucky today to be in a position to offer some responses. So you will present, each of you, your views on these questions, on this topic. And I want to congratulate Srilata again for this panel. And also, of course, Vignesh for the support he is always giving us in logistic terms. So I suggest we go by the order of the abstracts that you might have seen, and that you speak, each of you, something like 15 minutes in order to make sure that there is some conversation. The list of the participants is very large today, almost 90, which is of course due to you all, and to the subject. So I would invite, if this is fine with you, Srilata, the people who want to ask questions to use the chat for that. and we will make sure that most of the questions are addressed. We'll try to do justice to most of the questions, but for that, the paper givers have to be more concise. So I will immediately invite Malini to present their views on this subject, and that in 15 minutes or so. And all the others are invited to be on the mute mode, like myself.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much to King's India Institute for hosting this extraordinarily relevant, timely, and urgent series. Thank you to Professor Christophe Jaffrelot and my fellow panelists. Thank you to Dr. Srilata Sircar and Vignesh Rajahmani for organizing. So my talk today focuses on caste-based urban segregation and environmental injustices, what I refer to as environmental unfreedoms, to signal their life and dignity robbing traits. It draws on over a decade of research on informal housing and ecological vulnerabilities in Bengaluru in Karnataka, and in particular, a joint research project with Slum Jagatu, a Dalit journalism collective initiated in 2018. In DC, where I direct the Anti-Racist Research and Policy Center at American University, I have been conducting research on environmental racism and the history of Black radical organizing in the city. So my theoretical lens, to some extent, is shaped in a contrapuntal way by questions of environmental and racial injustice in the US. I found that while analyses of racism have been foundational to environmental justice activism and civil rights law in the US, there has been a notable silence around questions of caste in environmental movements in India. With the exception of work by literary scholar Mukul Sharma, there are almost no studies on the operation of caste in ecology, nor of anti-caste intellectual history as it relates to the environment, let alone the urban environment. This is a troubling silence given how notions of caste purity and pollution and the spatiality of untouchability continue to structure all manner of environmental unfreedoms in urban India, from the health burdens and deaths of Dalit sanitation workers to uneven flooding and water access to evictions of Dalit majority slums, which I will talk about today. My core argument today is that driving environmental unfreedoms in Bangalore are legal discourses and practices that maintain the segregation of urban spaces and property. In particular, I show how the legal discourse of encroachment, originating in colonial lexicon, is used to criminalize Dalit settlements, while the infractions of dominant castes and wealthier groups are absolved. Of particular interest is how encroachment is fused with ecological justifications to banish oppressed castes further and further from the city, to, in effect, reinforce them as spatially and economically outcast. So I will start by reviewing the literature on caste and urban space, and then move to my empirical research in Bangalore. And before I do this, a word is in order about my social position and research ethics. I am the product of an intercaste marriage. At the age of 15, my mother tried to take her life when forced into an arranged marriage to her first cousin, who was of the same Malayali warrior caste. Years later, she met and married my father, a Tamil Brahmin, against the wishes of his mother and extended family. This forbidden union has to some extent shaped my anti-caste worldview from an early age. Still, I am cognizant of the privileges and risks of intellectual appropriation by Savarna academics. I try to practice an ethics of accompliceship. In my partnership with Slum Jagatu, I follow their lead on questions that need to be asked from the standpoint of Dalit epistemology. Given my positionality, I also have the ability to study up, that is to study the discourses of dominant caste urban residents and officials. This does not absolve me in participation in structures of caste privilege and academic privilege, but I hope that it helps to foster a more ethical and reflexive research process. I'm going to share my screen now and share a few slides. Scholars, poets, and writers have written on the topic of caste and space experientially, among other registers. For Bhimrao Ambedkar, untouchability was sustained not only by social hierarchy, but also by spatial distancing and demarcations of public and private property. The village well, the temple, even roads were off limits for so-called untouchables, who, despite their vital labors, were relegated to peripheral ghettos, that's actually the word Ambedkar uses, within the village, their very shadows and spit seen as contaminants. In volume 7 of his collected speeches titled, quote, The Untouchables, Who Were They and Why They Became Untouchables, Ambedkar theorizes untouchability as a spatial phenomenon. He says, and I quote, untouchability is not a case of social separation, a mere stoppage of social intercourse for a temporary period. It is a case of territorial segregation and of a cordon sanitaire, putting the impure people inside a barbed wire into a sort of cage. Every Hindu village has a ghetto. The Hindus live in the village and the untouchables in the ghetto, end quote. From an untouchable caste of Mahars, Ambedkar had experienced these indignities firsthand in rural India. Against Gandhi's romanticizing of the village, Ambedkar saw the modern city and, as Jesus Jairez Garza has argued, mobility through the modern city, through, for instance, buses and trains, as holding the potential to liberate Dalits from the grip of the caste system. Yet, as Gopal Guru has written, the city did not provide the escape hoped for by Ambedkar. As Guru puts it bluntly, quote, the social morphology of the village was replicated even in most of the urban cities of India, where elites do not distinguish untouchables from physical dirt, end quote. Class mobility via liberalization has to some extent attenuated caste disparities across urban India, especially among the more dominant and landholding other backward castes, OBCs, and touchable SC/ST groups, who have risen to political power over the last few decades, as Christophe Jaffrelot's work has shown. But as seen by the hazing, rape, and suicide of Dalit students, by the lynching of beef-eating Dalits and Muslims, and by slum evictions, the space of the city is not inclusive. Research by David Moss shows that caste, intersecting with gender, continues to structure access to peri-urban markets and employment, while, as Sukhdev Thorat has argued, the denial of property rights plays a major role in restricting opportunities, dignities, and life chances for the caste-burdened urban poor. In Bangalore, segregation along caste lines was practiced well before the British Army advanced on Mysore in the early 1800s, but was written into urban property regimes during the colonial period. Much like, as Rupa Vishwanath has argued, caste was inscribed into agrarian property regimes and debt bondage relationships throughout agrarian areas in India via colonial capitalism. My archival research has shown that with the outbreak of the plague epidemic in 1898 across South Asia, the Bangalore City Improvement Trust, which eventually became the City Improvement Trust Board, which eventually became the Bangalore Development Authority, or the BDA, was tasked with the eradication of slums thought to breed disease and criminality, as is pictured here. The, quote, depressed classes and, quote, Mohammedans were in particular targeted for so-called improvement, or what Stephen Legg calls improvement technique. Hygienic suburbs such as Jai Mahal, built by acquiring land via eminent domain, were priced out of reach for poorer and laboring castes, while upper castes harbored animists privately, barring entry to their neighborhoods and marketplaces, as the historian Janaki Nair has written. Noel Gist, an American scholar, reported in 1957 of his research in Bangalore that Brahmin-dominated and Muslim and Dalit localities, i.e. either ends of the caste and social spectrum, exhibited the deepest segregation. Meanwhile, as Hita Unikrishnan and colleagues have shown through historical research, Bangalore's famed keres, or lakes, were drained and repurposed for state projects in the post-colonial period, often driving out SC, ST, herders and farmers who accessed lakes as the commons for their livelihoods. Finally, in the most granular study on the topic of caste and urban segregation on Bangalore yet, Naveen Bharati and colleagues published a study in 2019, which found that caste segregation in Bangalore is fractal. This is the metaphor they use. mapping SC-ST presence at the census block scale, that is the smallest and most granular scale, they find segregation is ceaselessly reproduced at smaller and smaller scales, thus their use of the metaphor fractal. Because Dalits and Muslims alike are beef eating and work in leather tanning, their settlements co-locate and are ostracized ghettos within the census block level with precarious conditions of land tenure and urban services in those areas. All this has amounted to the fact that without sufficient housing options, without accessible housing options, due to BDA's structurally classist and casteist eligibility criteria, as well as neoliberal priorities in real estate and governance, SC and ST groups have increasingly been pushed to the urban periphery, including on flood-prone lakes, keres, and storm drains, Rajakalaves. The combination of institutional and private discrimination has led precisely to what Ambedkar had hoped against, namely the reproduction of the segregated village ghetto as the segregated urban ghetto. My own research brings to light some of the ethnographic stories and the oral histories underlying these patterns. I find that the relationship between segregation and urban ecology is recursive. That is, segregation drives ecological vulnerabilities, while ecological narratives drive further segregation. Take the example of Madina Nagar, pictured here, on the southern outskirts of Bengaluru, in the zone of Bommanahalli, an area of very rapid urbanization, in part due to the IT boom in the 1990s. Madina Nagar is a low-lying neighborhood built between two major lakes, Agara and Belandur. It is a highly flood-prone area and is also largely occupied by Dalit Muslims. I see that later on in the KCL series, you have a speaker talking about caste among Muslims. And this is, I think this is a really pertinent and understudied topic. And I myself have found that there are several Dalit Muslim areas in Bangalore. In 2014, I accompanied the assistant executive engineer, Mr. Majid, for a site visit to Madina Nagar. He pointed to a house that had been demolished by the city government, the BBMP, in an effort to make the city more flood-proof. However, he added, it's much easier for BBMP to demolish the encroachments of poorer people than to touch the large apartment buildings where middle-class people and RWAs are strong, end quote. Environmental unfreedoms, I have found, are multiple and layered. A Dalit Muslim community is ghettoized, precariously located near water bodies, and then evicted because they are easy targets of blame in an effort to flood-proof the city, in an era in which even moderate monsoonal rainfalls lead to flooding. To examine this argument further, one that also appeared in the news media following massive demolitions of lower middle-class settlements after flooding in 2015 in Bangalore, I started to research the legal discourse of encroachment together with Slum Jagatu. In 2018, I partnered with Slum Jagatu. It is led by a left, Dalit, journalist come activist, Isaac Arul Selva, and it has been documenting the history of land in Bangalore for 2 decades. Pictured on the right is its April 2018 issue commemorating Ambedkar Jayanti. As you enter Slum Jagatu's office in Koramangala, you can see a quote on the left. As long as lions have no historians, tales of history will glorify the hunter. Slum Jagatu's goal is to document these untold subaltern land histories against the hegemonic narratives of the hunter. One of its most high-profile battles in 2013 involved the eviction of 5,000 Dalit Christians from Yejipura slum in the upmarket neighborhood of Koramangala to make way for malls and luxury apartment buildings. Yejipura's residents have been resettled on the very, very outer fringes of the city. Slum Jagatu thinks of this case as a partial failure, but also recognizes that resettlement might have been much more difficult and inhumane if it hadn't been for their activism. Together, we investigated the case of Putanahalli Lake, pictured here in an aerial view, and the ongoing anti-eviction battle fought by Lakshmi Nagar slum, which is 99% Dalit, which I had started to look at 6 years earlier. So in the background of this photograph, you can see several large high-end apartment complexes developed by companies such as Larsen & Toubro and Brigade In the bottom right, in the foreground, you see a 30-year-old slum, Lakshmi Nagar slum. It's important to note that technically both are encroachers given their very close proximity to the lake. Both are built precariously close ecologically to the lake bund. It is also important to recognize temporality. Most of the apartment buildings were built in 2005, whereas the slum dates to the mid-1990s. Here's a close-up of the apartment complexes right next to the lake. And here's a close-up of Lakshmi Nagar slum. The slum comprises 100 households of rural migrants from drought-distressed Ramanagara district, about 45 kilometers away. Half the residents are from the Tigala caste, which is technically an other backward caste, whereas half are from the RD Karnataka or Dalit SC caste. So approximately 50% SC/ST and 50% OBC. Correct me earlier. Court documents procured through RTI refer to the residents as illiterates and poor persons who are, quote, eking out their livelihood by doing coolie work. It's really interesting for me to note that they use this term coolie in court documents. Crucially, oral histories and court records speak of the role of the Dalit Panthers and the Karnataka Liberation Panthers, Dalit political organizations modeled after the American Black Panthers, in helping to organize slum demands, especially as far as resettlement and property rights go. One of our most consistent findings is how the discourse of encroachment is weaponized against the slum dwellers, as if somehow its repeated incantation establishes encroachment as an undisputable truth. So for instance, in a circular issued by the Deputy Commissioner, survey number 42 of Puttanhalli village is a lake area and the same has been encroached by encroachers, and the said encroachers have to be evicted from the said place as recommended by the Lake Development Authority. Similarly, in an affidavit filed by a middle-class association run by upper caste apartment dwellers, mainly consisting of Brahmins and Jains, encroacher is similarly taken as a given. According to my interviews with these middle-class residents, the Puttanhalli Lake Neighborhood Improvement Trust, which is the organization that these middle-class apartment dwellers run, thinks of itself as an environmental conservation group whose main goal is to evict the slum and to reduce sewage outflows so that the lake can be enjoyed for recreational and bird watching purposes. Because of its membership, it enjoys direct access to bureaucrats. So this is kind of an instantiation of what Amitabh Bhaskar calls bourgeois environmentalism. In March 2019, the High Court of Karnataka issued a judgment that ordered the eviction of the slum dwellers to Beta Dasanapura, which is a very far-flung urban village located at the extreme edges of the urban conurbation. Again, because of the involvement of the Dalit Panthers and somewhat strong slum activists, the resettlement housing is not as inhumane as it was originally slated to be. That is tin closets measuring 20-30. They now have more reasonably sized houses, but it's very, very far flung from their places of livelihood and from their social connections. So I'll end now and look forward to more discussion. But I just want to say that efforts via Dalit journalism to kind of recover some of these histories of land and space and activism can be taken as partial victories, right? In the sense that they attenuate the inhumanity that's extended in some of these resettlement efforts. But there is still undeniably a trend of oppressed caste groups being concentrated on the urban periphery and further distances away from the city. As Selva put it to me, quote, Bangalore is like a village. In the center is the Agrahara, by which he means he's using a metaphor as a temple land typically reserved for Brahmins. On the outside are the untouchables. Land grabbing is reinforcing untouchability. And in my larger work, I look at the kind of counter-hegemonic discourse of land grabbing to call attention to the double standard by which encroachment is used as a discourse to criminalize lower class and oppressed caste groups. Finally, my work has pointed to how, quote, encroachment can be leveraged as a legal discourse to criminalize untouchable groups and can be mutually reinforced by ecological politics in the city. Thank you.
As usual. Thank you very much, Malini. That was really fascinating. And in 15 minutes sharp, though, that was really a tour de force. If we go by the order of the abstracts, I now invite Kalai to present in 15 minutes or so.
Thank you, Christophe. I should also thank Srilata and Vignesh for having me here. It's a great opportunity to share my work. So this work is sort of ongoing work of mine in Brown. I'll share my slides. Yeah. Yes, it's here. So yeah, this is based on my the current work, joint project I'm doing with partly the data that presented here is it's out of joint project I'm doing with Christophe. Basically, it's a large data sets from the economic census. It shows how caste is shaped or works with capital, in the sense who controls the enterprises, how the enterprises plays out across firm sizes. That's one. The second part, I should also thank the here in the Brown library and the IT wing, because they provided access to process this. This is huge voluminous data sets, some 50 million observations. Almost it has enterprises from the small vegetable vendor to the enterprises run by the Ambanis that way. So we don't have a cost details for all of these enterprises. We have a cost details for those who claim to be a private owners, in the sense the individual owners. So that's a data set we have. So I also have some field notes to make as to how caste shapes in everyday economic transactions. So it's broadly this how I structured. So what's a debate in the literature, the contemporary literature? So as you know now, from say particularly since 2000, there has been definitely debate on some way the capitalism or the rise of economic growth would actually facilitate mobility for the lower caste. That's one take, particularly that came from after the formation of Dalit Chamber of Commerce, which clearly says that some way the capitalism can destroy the caste, and if you are able to participate in the market forces, utilize it better, you will have some way the removal of caste distinction, and move on the social mobility, and you can acquire new social status. If you say some way it provided achievement over the ascriptive identities, that's a debate. That's an argument for to support some way capitalism can promote low caste entry into the economic mobility. The second argument, the countering that, is largely driven by Professor Barbara Arish's work. She's been documenting, particularly in the South India and other contexts too. No, it doesn't actually capture. In fact, reproduces caste. It absorbs. In fact, it uses in better way for its accumulation. It is not going to solve your purpose. This is a too broad position in India with respect to relationship between caste and capital. So what here I'm going to offer here is of some empirical evidence. Is that work that I'm going to show here is partly new, in the sense earlier this data-driven or empirical based work done by the two prominent work. One is by Iyer and Ashutosh Vashte in the Harvard business department. They've done this mapping the entire economic census, but that actually confines only till 2005. It doesn't go beyond, because when you want to really understand India's capitalism, its growth, because that's a period when you have say post 2005 is the period when you have a high growth rate in India. So therefore, I think we don't have any data after 2005 has anyone done detail as to how it played out in entrepreneurship. Second work is done by Barbara Arish and White. Again, that also confines to 2005. So there's no actually work concretely showing what actually happened. Is there really improvement in the position of Dalits and the OBCs in the broader scheme of entrepreneurship, particularly if you disaggregate it by size and different indicators? So there's no work on that. So I thought maybe we can process why no one has done this. Perhaps it's partly these data sets are huge, and it's to process micro level, it's really difficult. Perhaps that could be the one reason I assume. So then, of course, there are micro studies, field-based studies, ethnographic studies, say one by, say, Thamodharan, which actually provided who are this actually in post-90s occupied the spaces of entrepreneurship in broadly, sectors and castes, regions, all that is mapped. And of course, there are other micro studies in Tirupur. There's a fraternal capital there's another book in clusters in Tirupur, then different clusters in Ludhiana. So there are micro studies, but there is no comprehensive studies to show at the macro level, actually who controls, if you see the scheme of capital. I mean, if the capital has a caste in it. So that's I'm going to provide today some indicator, some basic, why it is, yeah. So this is the world of capital in India. So I have here the entire universe of the capital in India, one from the small enterprises to the big enterprises. So I have here the two component in India broadly, if what you call as a you can distinguish it to three part. One is obviously there's a public PSU units, and of course there are this non-corporate private capital, and of course corporate capital. You can have three distinctions. Out of three distinctions, roughly one can say 60% of the enterprises are controlled by the private individual owners, and another 20% come from corporate, but the sizes are very big. Although the numbers are small, corporate, in terms of volume of enterprises, but the decisive power in the, controlling the market, controlling the GDP growth as a decisive, more power. There's absolutely no doubt about it. So now we can say, we can exclude the PSU. We have caste data on the private enterprises, which controls roughly 60%, whose share maybe in the GDP would be roughly 40%. That's an estimation by economists. And the corporate sector, which is small in numbers, but have a decisive control over the economy. This is the world of capital. So here, how I process, you can see the numbers. India also is another characteristic. The economists actually describe India's structure of economy, what they call as a missing middle. You have a tiny enterprises, then you have a huge tiny enterprise, then you have a small few corporate which controls. That's a broad narrative. So as I mentioned here, so we have some observations of some 58 million, out of which we have caste data for some 60% of the enterprises. Of that we have a caste details. When I say caste details, we should be careful. I don't have a specific caste. I have only the administrative categories, what you call SCs, STs and OBCs and the upper caste, which call non-SC, non-ST, OBC, which are like, of course, it is followed in hierarchy, but there are, variations within that. So it's just a broad administrative categories I have. So now let us look at who controls capital in India. First cut, take the all enterprises, which is small, medium, big. Definitely there is a, this first slide here, you can see, look at it. There is some improvement from say 98 to 2014, some, improvement from 8% to 11%, which is therefore the argument that some way the Dalits and the OBCs are improved in their position in space of entrepreneurship, partly true when you look at an overall trend. Of course, even if you look at the disaggregate by sector, there is also improvement of their position partly, but nonetheless, their position, if you look at overall terms, it's much shorter than their population size. Say, for instance, in Dalits, if you look at the medium enterprise, which is, I have a table here, the medium enterprises, which is the size of, say, the firms which has more than 20 worker or 100 worker, is say 9%, which actually the population of the SCs is 17%. Similarly, if you take the OBCs, it's 32%, but OBC's population is say 42 or 44%. Conservative estimate, it goes to 50% in the other estimates. So broadly, what one can say is, in the private, where you have a caste details of the enterprises, you clearly see there is an improvement of Dalits and the OBCs since 90s, particularly 98 to last 15 years till 2014. But if you disaggregate by size, their representation definitely comes down. It is an exaggerated claim to make actually as they really substantially progressed. Remember, again, we are talking about as a non-corporate private sector. We don't have a data on the corporate sector, which has a decisive power. So first cut here, the non-corporate sector, definitely there is an improvement if on their own terms, in the sense from say Dalit moved from 3% to 9%, this is substantial progress. But in the overall scheme of things, they're nowhere close to their population representation. Same with the OBCs, which is relatively better compared to Dalits from 21 to 32, but still it's much shorter than their population size. So this is the case in the broader, what you call private non-corporate enterprises. But again, let's see who controls the corporate capital. We don't have a data of the caste details of the owners because it's a corporate, it's a public, some way of the joint ownership with the stakeholder, right? So some data actually based on the field work and collected the board members of corporate sector, which is say they collected for almost 4,000 firms, and they have the numbers of caste details of some 9,000 members, out of which they looked at the caste details of the corporate members, which shows roughly 92% come from the Brahmins and the Vaishyas, which is in the corporate. Of the 9,000 members, 92%, roughly Brahmins 44% and the Vaishyas 46% control the corporate membership. And Dalits and the OBCs in that corporate members details roughly say 7%, 3.8 plus 3.5. So if you can see, this is the character of capital in India. One level, you have some progress in the private, small, medium scale enterprises of Dalits and the OBCs in that, whereas in the corporate sector, decisively controlled, disproportionately controlled by the caste elites, which is say, if you go by this data sets, 92%. This is an individual corporate. We don't have the caste details in the data. In the sense, it's like individually done by looking at the members of the boards of those corporates. So this is your the caste characteristic of Indian capital. So to make a claim that the capital as you progresses, accumulation takes place, you will have a removal of your caste distinction is, I think, too far-fetched. It doesn't support empirical evidence. But nonetheless, it has provided mobility. That's also, one can reject that. For instance, from 98 to 2014, you see definitely a doubling of the position of the enterprise for Dalits and the OBCs, which is minor, but it's a tiny, but still it's visible, right? That makes more important. If you given the larger scheme of things, there is still margin. But this relative position improvement also one has to acknowledge. But again, as I mentioned in the corporate fully controlled by 92%, is small. I don't think no other place you will have this sort of disparity. Small elite with the percentage controls 92%, whereas the large population has just 7% of the share in the corporate sector, which is very interesting look at. So now I looked at where are these Dalit enterprises come from? Are they located in a particular few states, or concentrated in few states, or the widespread across India? But there's definitely a pattern emerges. It's a very interesting pattern. I control with the population size of the each state to the total population of Dalit population in India. You clearly see a pattern. More of the southern part, except West Bengal, is lot more. All of these enterprises come from southern and western India, largely for Dalits. That even if you control by size, from initially you take all forms, then you take by, say, for the medium form, which is 20 and 99 between the size, and if you take the firms which are more than 100 workers. Definitely all of these enterprises are located in the states that I mentioned: Tamil Nadu, Bengal, Maharashtra, AP, and Karnataka. This is, you can see the line that goes of the fitting line goes that those above are the better off given their population size. This is disproportionately more enterprises. So in the sense, it's largely concentrated on southern and western states. Even if you look at the OBC enterprises, which is almost same pattern of it is more in Tamil Nadu particularly, and Karnataka and AP and Gujarat. So these are the states which, again, if you look at all sizes, you will find this concentration of the enterprises among this. The question arises, maybe perhaps you need to think why these states, if you look at the Dalit population in the total India's Dalit population, northern state would actually dominate. BR and particularly UP controls about 20% of Dalits in the total Dalits. So, but if you look at the south and western, there you will see the more presence of the enterprise. So we need to think as to why these regions actually offered some mobility despite, having wide level of caste practice in everyday life, but still provided an opportunity for Dalits and OBCs, particularly in the south and west. But interestingly, if you look at the upper caste enterprise, which is non-Dalit and non-OBCs, in this case, it's little widely spread. You can see that, the earlier maps you would have found only the few states actually concentrated, but here you see the little widely spread. So one may argue from this that the Dalits OBC entry in business is function of their entry in politics and early social mobilization. Perhaps this is making an hypothesis based on even the recent work by Amit Aguja makes the case that, where the social mobilization to the region which witnessed social mobilization has seen economic mobility for Dalits. Perhaps that could be true, and even same extent for the OBCs particularly in the southern part of India. And there is another hypothesis which economic historian makes, that the southern states has some way offered a mobility for the subalterns because there's a vice vacuum. They call us, there's no entrenched the Vaishya capital. Therefore, this allowed space for others to occupy that position. But how much that position the space offered for the Dalits is still a question. But given the mobility, it has some presence in it. This is the broader trend. But more interesting is, if you disaggregate how one became entrepreneurship, how that caste matters in this. Someone becoming an entrepreneur. So, for what is a successful to become an entrepreneur? What is the character of successful entrepreneurship? One, you need to have a minimum capital to begin with. Of course, access to the market. Let's have these two categories broadly. If you look at the source of finance, popular perception is, even for the Dickey, which came Dalit Chamber of Commerce, claim is that we need to get support from the state, as a support for the capital to either access to bank loans or, the other forms of support. But if you look at data, in fact, contrary to the popular perception, it is in fact upper caste who benefited from the state resources. Say almost most of them come from self-finance, but in the case of caste-wise details of us getting the assistance from the government or the financial institutions, it is not SCs, not even the OBCs. It is largely the upper caste who benefited most from this assistance from the government or accessing the institutional finance. So therefore, it's clear some way that while everybody begins largely from the initial capital from their own corbus, which is a family or inherited wealth, but the state assistance actually provided more to the elite than the Dalits and the OBCs. This is the data from the census shows. Then even if you look at the sectors, again, there is some sort of concentration in some area. Some sectors you have a more presence of the upper caste. For instance, take the education, where if you look at the distribute their own enterprise across sectors, you'll find upper caste has more presence there, 14%, as compared to say Dalits 4.2 or OBC 7%. So what we witness here, while Dalits or non-Dalits could actually go to the area or the sector where it is considered to be historically Dalit occupied area, for integrated leather industry, or even for the OBCs whose occupation area, where the non-OBCs can enter, the upper caste enter. But whereas for Dalits to enter the non-Dalits occupation as a sector is very difficult. So what we are actually facing here is some way caste and occupation and entrepreneurship works as offers a dual disadvantage to the Dalit entrepreneurship. What I mean by dual disadvantage, to move from one's own occupation, you have to work hard, achieve an education, progress in some level of mobility to get into a modern sector. Well, this is one level of difficulties. First, to acquire this education, acquire this resources to participate in the modern sector. Second disadvantage is in the modern sector, there is already one who has already entrenched in it. So you need to compete with, you need to have additional support, additional education, additional barrier that exists there. So what you are actually having caste and occupation link actually provides a double disadvantage to move from one caste-based occupation to the other caste-based occupations. I think I'm making sense. It's a very important thing I find here. So this is what I say. double disadvantage with respect to caste and occupation and entrepreneurship. So one more thing we need to keep in mind from the this data set, the data descriptions, and even the fieldwork notes confirms one trend, which is clearly the Dalit capitalism some way is a function of affirmative action. It's a very provocative claim I'm making. Why I'm making is, although the Dalit capitalism as a, or even far into some extent for the OBCs too, thought that through, rather than looking for affirmative action, we can participate in the market and move on. We can be independent in our own ways. Actually, that doesn't work. Why? Because if you look at all of the entrepreneurs who become successful among these communities, have some way of connection to participated in the program of affirmative action. Either their parents who participated and benefited out of it because of their money, initial wealth, initial support of the family, you actually brought some resource to start a business. So particularly in the absence of land or any inherited wealth, this affirmative action plays a huge role in getting to initial money, initial, what you call the initial capital to begin with something. Therefore, to say that, we can move beyond affirmative action, get a participate in the market through becoming oneself, entrepreneurship and participating in business, I think it doesn't support with the empirical evidence. One. Second, as I mentioned earlier, there are certain sectors which are disproportionately concentrated by certain caste groups, and it restricts opportunity for others to enter. For example, take the food processing. You can't enter, become everybody can own the hotels if your caste is visible. So that way, some way, it's still the caste purity and the religious sanction works there. And as I mentioned earlier, again with the occupation, some occupation linked with Dalits, which that be now taken by leather industry, other than taken by the non-Dalits, but Dalits can't enter to the other occupation. That is not easier. That mobility is not possible. So some way still that old occupation and purity, some way is operating in the modern domain as well, if you look at this trend. As importantly, entry barrier, again, to certain caste is vanished. For Dalits, those others can enter, but Dalits can't enter the other sectors. So, but it's given this, there's an attempt, but the key, which is Dalit Chamber of Commerce and others, trying to some way emulate the practices that the other followed in acquiring capital and acquiring mobility. But if you look at the overall trend, doesn't support any evidence that we moved in. But despite the relative mobility that partly that we see in the last 15 years. So given this,
is this your last slide?
Yeah, it's last slides.
Good.
So it's a policy intervention. Again, I just run through this. The public sector bank was supposed to provide a mandatory credit to the particularly Dalits. Its record is poor, and the range of reasons, because the lack of collateral is seen as one of the important reasons. Then comes against the support, the capital support that's from the Scheduled Caste Finance and Development Corporation. That's again, it's provided, but if you look at the actual needs and the support it's given is very, very minuscule, very, very tiny minority. So again, the 4% reservation for Dalits in the PSU, again, that's not been implemented well. So even the most importantly, the corporate sector, which actually opposed the reservation in the private sector, said that we will do voluntary support for the vendors. His record also poor. If you look at the report submitted to Parliament by the Department of Industry, it clearly shows the corporate sector has done very, very, very negligible amount. So again, I'm just concluding this, as Baba Ambedkar said in 50s, we are entering in a contradiction, which is one level you will have a political equality, another level you will have economic equality and social inequality, which is what called the life of contradiction that India enters in 50s. So if you take the stock of it, how much actually we moved from this? I think we maybe have progress in certain sectors, but in domain of entrepreneurship, still that divide continues to persist. One level you have a tiny minority control the entire corporate sector and most of the businesses, and the majority is still being excluded from that processes. Those who even benefited out of this in the process are largely come from states like southern and western states, particularly that could be a function of social mobilization of those states. And reservation definitely worked, building a certain minimum, at least a critical mass to enter. But that could be excluding for many within those communities, what we call intra-caste or maybe sub-caste equalities, but still provide a critical cream to participate in this business. Otherwise, even that exists, the group that exists in this business would have not existed without affirmative action. As Thomas Piketty in recent book mentioned, compared to US, affirmative action some way worked in India, reducing caste inequality, notwithstanding issues of intra-caste, sub-caste inequalities. So I just stop here. Maybe I'll pick up some questions on this. Thank you.
Thank you, Kalai, for this great presentation. And yes, you have taken us from caste in the city to caste in the industry, but the industry is in the city anyway. So we are still in the same perimeter. Can you just stop sharing your screen, Kalai, so that we can return? Thank you so much. Great. Excellent. So I now turn to Bhuvaneswari for our own presentation, and then we'll have some discussion, some Q&A. Please.
I had to unmute. Yeah. Good morning, good afternoon, and evening, wherever you're located. Thank you, Srilata, for this opportunity, and thank you, Christophe, for chairing the session, and my fellow panelists and participants for taking time to listen to some of the findings from my various field research in India. Much of the arguments that I'm going to forward in this presentation echoes what Malini and Kalaiyarasan asserted in the earlier presentation. Prior moving to the arguments itself, I would like to state my positionality. I come from a privileged caste and also a relatively privileged class background, and there is a certain, I recognize the discomfort and the injustices that I might do to represent the to do full justice to the experiences of the communities that I'm going to speak about and their experiences in the city. Yeah. Having said that, I'm coming into this presentation from the angle of an architect and a physical planner, and from that perspective, I'm going to look at how land and other urban resources get shared. In this context, what I wish to argue is that caste continues to be a key force in driving the production and reproduction of property relations in city, particularly the property relation in land. And this is critical because land affects your ability to enact your economic, particularly to enter into economy and move up, as well as it affects your chances to enter into a decent housing opportunity in the city. How is it exemplified? I developed this argument by looking at the ways in which we use occupied physical spaces of a city and the ways in which institutions, particularly the state, configure property relation in land. The ways in which we unconsciously produce caste in everyday life is exemplified by the dynamics of occupying space in a classroom setting at one of India's premier technological institutions. The social hierarchy among students is reflected in their unspoken agreements based on rank, branch of study, and the ability to speak English. These categories mask the caste and class biases at work. While the allocation of rooms in the hostel is based on lottery in the first year, students are allowed to choose their roommates in subsequent year. This is when networks along rank, language, school affiliation, and inevitably caste gets consolidated and marked in spaces where they inhabit. It's both in terms of their physical and potential economic spaces. What was concerning was the anxiety and burden that students from tribal community and Dalit communities in this particular institution shouldered to prove themselves. As Ajanta Subramaniam documents in the question of merit, they are continuously subjected to fighting the biased view they are there because of reservation and not worthy of it. The life chances of students inside these institutions and beyond in space and time are patterned by networks of caste regional and school affiliation, and the ability to speak English. Thus, this is evidence. The way these networks can affect one's mobility is exemplified in the case between a software engineer from the Dalit community working in California and the Cisco. According to Dalit and tribal students, networks matter as they regulate the flow of information about group work, jobs, and ways of negotiating life in the institution. And the relationship and interaction between various caste networks and regional networks are often superficial. The social landscape of this institute, situated in the metropolis and whose alumni now work in global cooperation on teaching Ivy League institutions across the globe, turns out to be islands of caste and regional affiliation whose boundaries are carefully preserved and perpetually and flows monitored. Institutional practices around room allocation, categorizing students along the lines of merit and housing them in different buildings tend to reinforce existing caste-based biases and perpetuate already existing inequalities. How does this relate to the city, you may ask? The very process of sorting people and categorizing who can use where and which land and who can have what type of property relations in land is how these inequities, caste-based inequities, get replicated in cities. It's true, both Ambedkar and Pule saw the city as a space where caste identities can be erased, but the continuing predominance of the networks and its role in shaping institutional practice, not only within the state, as well as the ways in which urban land and housing markets work, suggest that it seems to be a dream yet to be realized. One of the ways in which property relations in land is structured can be analyzed through looking at how cities are built, particularly how our future cities are built. Here, very often, the master plan comes into debate. Take, for example, the spatial morphology of any Indian cities. This is divided along the lines of planned and spontaneous developed layouts. Take the case of Bangalore, or then the Lutyens' Delhi, that is dominantly occupied by households with a stable employment in bureaucracy or in the corporate sector and income, and stable income or employment in the bureaucratic or corporate sector, what is dubbed as the formal sector of the economy. These localities present a stark contrast to the resettlement colonies, privately developed colonies with deficient infrastructure and congested housing conditions, quarter settlements, where at least 2/3 of the city's population that rely on various types of small manufacturing, trade, repair services, and declining formal sector manufacturing mill employment live. Layering the occupational caste and spatial histories of this neighborhood would reveal how caste is etched in our city's physical and social spaces intergenerationally. Although more research is required in the context of Chennai, if you look at the genealogy of land development and oral histories of the ways in which several South Chennai neighborhoods developed, reveal how previous patterns of land ownership have extended the dominant patterns of caste class domination. The street names and caste domination of South Chennai neighborhoods are examples. They are in stark difference in terms of wealth, culture, and vulnerabilities faced by population in the North Chennai. This is captured eloquently in the vernacular movie Vada Chennai, which is the housing and working site of working class and historically disadvantaged caste communities. Properties, as anthropologists would argue, is the relationship between two people over an object or a subject. The terms of this relationship define the boundary of what is included and therefore who can benefit and who cannot. Property practices are about boundary acts. In the context of cities, these boundary acts play out in the definitions of legitimate and illegitimate users of space, an illegal and illegal city, and the formal and the informal city. The ways in which the spaces, this caste and class domination are justified is through perpetuating the binary way, is through looking at the city using this binary lens. It is the space that are dominantly inhabited by already oppressed groups that falls under the category of illegal and informal. The politics of category is critical because legality and illegality are social construct, and anyone familiar with the politics of land classification and land use planning would know that moving people and their activities across these categories can happen by a stroke of the pen. A case in point is the experience of market traders and street vendors in the center city ward of Bangalore in South India, when the regional state passed a resolution to denotify land for relocating market traders with the intensification of contestation to hold on to their spaces. And the demand for the pressure to relocate the markets came from the corporate sector, which wanted to reconfigure property in this particular locality so that the South Bangalore wards, which is the dominant spaces, both of working and the residential spaces of the IT sector, can connect easily and seamlessly via the flyovers and metro rails to the neighboring cities of Bangalore. And often this is a pattern that keeps replicated whether you look at Chennai or Delhi or Mumbai. Planning instruments such as denotification, public-private partnerships, transfer of land development are constantly mobilized to reclaim land for uses that are defined as productive and profitable. While these actions may affect different caste groups, the worst affected are members of Dalit community who depend on street vending, domestic work or market labor, or on the cheaper housing accommodation that exists in this place. There are two dimensions to the linkages between property practices and caste. The first relates to the role of the state in distribution or allocation of urban land. Writings on cities have shown that city spaces are an outcome of contestation between different groups to claim land and infrastructure that they need to generate an income and for their shelter. At a surface level, a master plan may appear as a neutral, rational, and emancipatory instrument to distribute land, but a closer look would reveal the politics of planning. The way the tool is used depends on who wields it and on whose behalf. One is reminded here of Flyberg's seminal work on rationality and power that eloquently illustrated how power is the context of rationality. As Malini's presentation eloquently showed, it's often this language of illegality and encroachment that often gets mobilized to push people out of their spaces. Now, it's useful to pause here and see that legality and illegality themselves are political constructs, and they are very fluid constructs. And particularly master plan, the ways in which it has been flexibly used with the Indian cities trying to world itself, it's come out again and again that properties get reconfigured. Just because one has property rights to a particular piece of land, that in itself does not guarantee that you have certain stability to use the land, as the case of the market traders showed. That not all the market traders in the center city ward of Bangalore that I was discussing are informal traders, or neither were they encroachers. A substantial proportion of the small traders, and particularly the retail traders and wholesalers, owned the shops. They owned the shops, they had a right to the property. However, the use of this denotification as an instrument is what pushed them into illegality and forced them to move out of their land. This, together with evoking eminent domain as a clause for acquiring land, has always meant that your property rights in paper need not necessarily be a stable right, particularly in contemporary Indian cities. Why so? While the earlier forms of master plan revolved around the land allocation for various uses, more driven by the logic of economy than by equity, and in which the planners and bureaucrats were the Promethean figure. With India's race to worldly cities, the politics of land took a new turn. The state's intervention in land in the forms of several disconnected mega urban development projects located in special purpose institutions undergirded by new laws meant contesting these projects are equally different. These are increasingly used to restructure neighborhoods, evict settlements, and relocate households to the outskirts to pave way for easy takeover of land on behalf of land developers and corporates. Land, as Eric Dennis argues, is the new gold mine. It's not now just a physical space or stage on which economic or social acts are enacted, but it is the new instrument of finance. Both developed land within the city and pristine land are targeted, mobilizing instruments such as public-private partnership, transfer of development rights, and new laws such as the Land Acquisition Act, and more recently, the Land Assembly Bill for promoting large townships, as in the case of Haryana and Bihar. Property is continuously reconfigured to release land for what are considered as profitable activities. One may argue, well, that has to do with how capitalism works. What has this got to do with caste? However, it's useful to pause here and address the question whose land gets targeted and whose property gets reconfigured in these contestations and who gets labeled as illegal and encroachers. The case of Kaputli colony, a squatter settlement that developed in a strategic location in Delhi, is a case in point. The colony, the location of artisan tribes from Andhra Pradesh and Rajasthan, Muslims from Bihar, Dalits in waste picking, and other caste groups working in industries, in nearby industries, was targeted for development under the public-private partnership and the transfer of land development involving India's major developer. The terms of the contractor, as well as the project document itself, was authored by the developer. And that tells you the relationship that urban development authorities and large developers have, and in effect, who controls the decision making within these institutions. The terms that were largely written obviously to benefit the developer and squeeze the occupants to a narrow place, and it led to prolonged confrontation. The politics of reclaiming land from the residents of Kaputli colony played out in courts, media, and the corridors of power, and it often revolved around the state's attempt to restrict the number of household and forms of housing unit. Interestingly, while in the initial stage, the residents wanted a share of land, the narrative from the development authorities' side was often housing interpreted as 2 rooms with a bath, and land is something that they were unwilling to negotiate about. In fact, the project document claimed that the colony would be redeveloped in situ and legal titles to occupancy would be issued. The reduction of housing to land and moving people to any location in the city is then used as a justification to evict squatter settlements and relocate them to the outskirts. It then makes wonder whether keeping a particular Dalits and oppressed people in cities in a particular state of ambiguity and a particular state of vulnerability is a deliberate act, and it's perpetuated through institutional practices. These practices of caste and class are very subtle and invisible, and therefore contesting them is also equally difficult. And together with the new laws that is in place, even the courts took the view in the Kaputli colony's case that we are there to interpret only the law. And the developer had written into the master plan document that PPP is the only way by which this particular settlement will be developed. And not only that, in contrast to the earlier forms of master planning, the master plan documented in detail the share of the land that has to go to the developer and the share of the land that will be allotted to the households. And it is to this extent that rules get reconfigured, and it is through these subtle practices that existing inequalities get reinforced in city spaces. Coming back to the relocation colonies, these are places where poor households from different parts of the city are concentrated. Though they are justified as necessary to provide legal legitimate claims to land, in reality, titles have rarely been transferred in the name of relocatees. relocated families. On the other hand, the experience of households in relocation colonies of Chennai would reveal the move has heightened their vulnerability. Travel to work is difficult, and the lack of employment opportunities as well as safety within the colonies pushes men, women, and children to travel into the city and to live in payments sometimes and often in high rental accommodation. Both the time and space shrank with the move. So in a sense, the move pushed them further downward rather than helping them to consolidate their position, which they have built over the years. Some households had to sell their houses, and the new buyers are the young middle-income couples from ascending caste working in factories. Most Dalit families who were shifted to the resettlement site were middle-aged or did not have the school education to be able to find employment in the housekeeping jobs that the new economy opened for them. Accompanying a young school leaver, Rex, from the UK to the resettlement site, where he researched the aspiration of children, was really revealing. The children's narrative were telling, as many wanted to become a doctor or a police officer or a collector and go to America. Their knowledge of geography was limited to the colony, the neighborhood where they came from, and their native place and their dreamland America that they heard about in movies. Their aspirations speak of the desire for a complete rupture from the past, and the power of each of these occupations would provide them to do so, but the physical spaces in which they are contained acts as a constraint. What about the markets, you may ask? Land and housing markets, as Ian Cook has documented in the context of Bangalore, and as my research in Sriperumbudur shows, are patterned by caste networks. And therefore, whether it is finding a rental accommodation, as one of the commentators asked, or purchasing the land, caste networks still hold a major thing. And when it comes to resettlement, as the evidence from Sriperumbudur in Chennai show, Dalit families often rely on customary forms of claims on land. So the question of compensation really does not make much sense to them, because often they are said, you don't hold this land legally. Again, when it comes to even this is a even in this part of Chennai, even though under the Bhudan movement they were allotted land, the land is yet to be transferred to them, and therefore technically on the property papers the land was with the institution name, and therefore none of the Dalit families benefited or could claim to the land that they actually owned once upon a time. Finally, if the urban development strategies reinforces already existing inequalities in the city, the practices we adopt to maintain the city further deepen it. The condition of manual scavengers is a case in point. Conversations with a group of manual scavengers in West Delhi illustrate how, despite the law, they are still forced to handle human waste, although it's explicitly prohibited by law. Their own settlement, abutting a drainage colony of the city, has no underground drainage network. And one of the anxiety for each of these families is to have a toilet. And the toilet is an aspiration, partly because that's, according to one of the respondents, he said that they didn't want to deal with their own waste, having to deal with the entire city's waste. Even though they are aware of the law, they have been negotiating with the police institutions, and they are also well entrenched in the political parties, implementing it still remains a hard struggle. But it raises another question for us. How do we build our cities, and how do we make technical decisions with respect to infrastructure provision in the city? After all, technical decisions are social decisions. Is it that the availability of the bodies of Dalits for waste work is making us complacent with the existing situation and not forcing us to see technical solutions to annihilate this form of injustice? Finally, echoing with Kalaiyarasan's argument, in the research in a small town in Tamil Nadu, it revealed that caste networks influence the ability of different caste groups to enter into economic sector. And whilst in the town of Tiruchenkodu, which is located very near Tirupur, the global capital of textile production in Tamil Nadu, although manufacturing and the borewell rig industry opened up economic and social mobility for land-owning counter caste communities and also to an extent the weaving caste communities, Dalit groups and Vanya communities in these towns are still finding it very difficult to enter into any new economic sector. And this is partly because networks regulate how you access land, how you access built property, and how do you access your government fund schemes and access to finance. And I conclude with a few reflections on possibilities for expanding the political spaces for Dalits and other oppressed groups to claim the city. And legal rights in itself is proving to be limited. The politics, it is here I wonder whether the politics exposed by a leader of the Dalit community from Tamil Nadu shows a promise which involves reading the caste as a race question. Whether the category of caste itself is more splitting groups rather than bringing together. In a recent interview in a social media, he argues that much of the groups that is listed in the scheduled list are basically racial categories. And if that is used, is it possible to build a wider alliance to counter the dominant Brahminical ideology and its attendant institutional practices? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bhuvaneswari. The last sentence you have just uttered made me think about Dr. Ambedkar's formula. The caste system is not only a division of labor, but a division of the laborers. And I'm sure we will return to issues of that kind in the discussion. I will try to initiate the discussion with only few remarks and questions, but it was so rich and so stimulating that I will maybe take a little bit more than 10 minutes. I'll take the papers in the order, and I will really limit myself to few remarks and questions. Malini, in your presentation, what I found, of course, very appropriate is to use Ambedkar as a starting point precisely, because if someone knew what it meant to travel from the village to the city and to continue to suffer from the stigma of caste, it was the Mahars. Mahars were the first ones to do it. And at the same time, when they started to work in the textile mills or in the docks, they continued to be in Dalit bastis, such of kinds of Dalit bastis. The questions I'd like to ask you, especially in reference to Bangalore, when you mentioned that after the plague of 1908, you had Dalits and Mohammedans somewhat targeted the same way. You know, that came back in your presentation later on, as if we needed to bracket together these two groups, as if they were the two categories of untouchables, so to speak. You suggested because of the meat they were eating, that's one of the factors. There may be others, but my questions are elsewhere. As you say, there are castes within Muslims. So the Muslims who live next to the Dalits, are they also from the same caste? You know, is caste transcending religion in that case? And do we see this till today when we have some dynamics, you know? Sometimes the Muslims and the Dalits live next to each other. There is only one railway line in the middle. You know, the railway line, the road, seen as the border. We see that in Dwapura, in Ahmedabad. We see this in Agra. We see this in so many places. But they fight each other occasionally at the time of riots. So this relationship between Muslims and Dalits in the city, that's something I would very much like you to return to. And the other question I would like to ask you is about what about class among Dalits? In a place like Bangalore, those who can benefit from reservations, those who can really become bourgeois-like, I know that in the next seminar, Jasmeet Singh Sira will present something along these lines. So to prepare the comparison, I would like you to ask, where do the Dalit go when he is becoming a bourgeois, if anywhere? And does class make a difference in this dynamic? Kalai, that was of course fascinating, and the comment you have of this data is helping us to make sense of all these issues, and I fully agree with your conclusion. It's only because of reservations that you have some entrepreneurs among Dalits. Without this, I would say, background, that would not be possible. And that's why the geography you show is the geography of the states where emancipation has been possible because of reservations over more than one century. And the Dalit entrepreneurs are in the sectors they were supposed to continue to occupy. So to be a leather worker, and to be a leather entrepreneur is somewhat very similar. In fact, I came across Bidi kings among Dalits as well, local Bidi kings, yes, but Bidi is not certainly the industry upper caste would like to indulge in. So this is very convincing. I would make two comments and well, ask one question. One comment is about caste in the corporate sector. What Jules Naudet, one of my colleagues in France, has shown recently is very interesting in the sense that it shows that certainly Brahmins and Banyas are at the helm of this corporate sector. But Banyas are the owners, they don't need more than a BBA, and Brahmins are the executives, and they are the ones who really make the company work. It's interesting, division of labor continues at that level. Yeah. And that's why I would go further in the direction you have shown. Beyond the big aggregates, don't we need to look at subcaste? We need to certainly go further in this direction. And the other question I wanted to ask you is about reservation in the private sector. As you said, there is not much to say about it, but what went wrong under the UPA government when the ID was pushed and the CII was prepared to play balls with the government? So what happened really, if anything, on that front? And Bhuvaneswari, I sorry, that's I really of course finishing a book on the emergency. I appreciated what you said about policy, planning, city planning, politics of planning land as a major asset, and the implications of relocation. When you are driven out from central Delhi and you end up in Trilokpuri, you are losing your socio-economic resources, everything. So that's something that needs to be repeated. Now there are two questions that well, in fact, three small ones. One is, what about caste in the slum? You visit Dharavi, you don't see Dalits, no. You see subgroups of Dalits.
Yes, you see Kumbars and yeah.
Exactly, and that takes me to my Ambedkar citation. We keep saying Dalit, but if we look at the geography of a slum, a topography of the slum, where is the unity? That's one question. Another question is about, as you said, toilet is an inspiration. What is your assessment of the Swachh Bharat program on that front? Does it have any emancipatory power? Or on the contrary, does it confine the sweepers to manual scavenging? And that's a very important question, because I think I think that there is a real ambiguity there, and if you can help us to see through it, it would be very helpful. And last but not least, the notion of caste networks works, I would say, both sides. Upper caste certainly rely a lot on it, but what about Dalits? What about the caste networks of Dalits? Do they help? And if so, what is the unit of analysis? Again, don't we have to go back to fall back on the jati only?
Okay.
So you don't need to respond to my questions because I'm sure there'll be many more in the chat and in the other box that you might have visited. So what I prefer to do is to let you.
I see 14 questions, Professor.
Yeah, I know. So I hope you have been able to look at some of them and pick and choose in order to respond. What I suggest to make it more lively, if each of you respond to three questions each, then we'll have a first round, and then we will try to do justice to all the questions in the 30 minutes or so that we still have. Is that okay with you, Srilata, if we proceed along these lines?
Yes, I think it sounds good. I have been collating the questions and sort of grouping them according to theme and who it is directed to. So maybe we can do a first round. Well, first of all, thank you so much to all the speakers and to Christophe for your excellent comments and excellent contributions. I think there is a lot of food for thought there, which also explains the many questions that we've been getting already. I think I will start by actually posing a set of questions to Kalai. A question comes from Favita Diaz, and they ask, isn't caste in itself a form of capital? And sort of building on that, one of the things that you mentioned was about how caste purity is more stark in certain sectors, sort of related to food, whereas in other sectors like the leather industry, we do see non-Dalit groups coming in. And that actually overlaps very well with the podcast episode that we are going to release tomorrow, where I speak to Dr. Shivani Kapoor from Jindal University as well, who's written her doctoral thesis about the leather industry in Western UP and studied sort of the caste elements and the caste dynamics in the politics, the political economy of the leather industry. And one of the questions that we discuss and that I would like you to also address, Kalai, is what do you think strategically is a more viable sort of approach? One, to facilitate mobility for Dalit groups outside of their traditional caste occupations, or to actually dismantle the stigma attached to certain caste operations and facilitate entrepreneurship and ownership within the sector for these groups. And kind of connected to that, we have one other question from S. Lalita, who asks if the entrepreneurship culture in India is pro-Dalit or not, and if the special component plan is more of a rights-based approach or a welfare approach. So I think there's quite a few kind of commonality and common themes running through those questions. So if you want to take that, Kalai, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll just begin from the order of the questions, comments by Christophe. So in the first, definitely, I'll just begin, it will be easier to kind of link with the question of the UPA reservation in the private. I'll take from there, then I can, connect this to other questions. So obviously, one thing we need to, contextualize the current debate on the reservation. There is some, I get a perception that some way for the last few years, it's been seen that, promotion of entrepreneurship is seen as a way for Dalit mobility or the, subaltern mobility in broader sense. Whereas on the same line, you also see the dismantling of the reservation, not dismantling, at least, weakening of the reservation policies by privatization and other ways. So as evidence shown, from field work and other forms, definitely whatever the critical mass that exists as an entrepreneurship among Dalits, it's definitely a function of some way connected to affirmative action. Either one of the family members would have benefited through that, you get some access, education, or initial money to enter into things. So therefore, it should not be seen as something at the cost of affirmative action. It should be, anything in the promotion of support of, forms of capital or other forms of support should go along with the support that exists in affirmative action. Should not be at the cost of affirmative action. It is seen as some way of as a binary, no, not at all as a substitute. It should perhaps as a complementary to, if at all one really believes in enabling building an enabling atmosphere for the Dalits and others low caste. This is one. Second, with respect to UPA and the performance of the corporate sector, see, this was a clear debate. It was actually almost that time the debate was rich in terms of the inclusion strategies in the modern or in the market, private sector, because we know from since 90s the size of the government sector has been shrinking in terms of public sector. Its share is actually shrinking. We also now, since the privatization actually began in 2003 onwards, when the first NDA came. The NDA has a history of privatization much faster than the UPA in that way. 2003-4 it came, it privatized many. So that actually reduced the actual position that was available in the public sector jobs. So therefore, this reservation came in the UPA time. But that time, the corporate sectors jumped in. CII, Corporate Confederation of Indian Industries, and FICCI came in saying that, we don't, let's not impose on reservation on us. We will actually voluntarily ensure some strategies of inclusion. So one of the promises they made is, we will try to actually build a mentorship, training program, and, other forms of incorporation. But the record actually shows, as I shown in the slides, from the government own government actually collected or asked all of these corporate bodies to show us what is the strategy, what is your track record of inclusion of Dalits and OBCs in your organization, and they're actually very dismal record. So therefore, I'm not sure. If you take in the US case, even many firms even the universities, private universities, goes on actually makes as a case a diversity as a form of its strategy. Including the across racial groups. But I don't see any voluntary coming in Indian corporate sector with respect to the caste, that we'll ensure, some sort of proportional or some sort of representation of thing. It's only, we don't have any record. It also, whenever the privatization comes, the reservation, the privatization comes, and the corporate entity comes in, we will do voluntary. But we don't have any record to show so far they have done as a evidence that, corporate actually takes care of this question. No, I don't see I don't know what's the way out, perhaps, but the record doesn't promise us that corporate actually doing this. So that's a thing. Maybe whether the solution is to reservation in the private sector, that is open to the debate, but record doesn't show that it has actually voluntarily done this. So second, with respect to caste itself as a capital, yeah. See, this is a fascinating work, right? Of course, those who know the sociologist Bourdieu's work as the form of capital from social capital, there's a transformation from economic to social too. So obviously in India, it's actually, there are, if you look at the literatures, anti-caste literatures, there are some born capitals in India, right? There are some people who actually born with intellect, born with education, born with trading. There are others who actually born with doing a service sector, doing service to others. The manual jobs to others. So in that context, when you have a divide which is given by birth and also cumulatively build over a centuries, obviously you will have an advantage. Some people who exploit that advantage into the modern sector. If you look at when the colonialism came, we have enough evidence, historical literature such as who benefited from the colonial administration. We also know when before reservation implemented, who benefited from even the post-colonial Nehruvian administration, or even the national buildings. We clearly show, unless the reservation was implemented, until the reservation was implemented, by this population very, very small, those spaces. Obviously, caste certainly works as a capital to enter into a modern sectors. And that actually, it depends on how even the institution facilitates that. That's what more, interesting in the sense that certain institution facilitates converting this caste capital into a modern capital. So that's actually something we need to think of, not only inherited capital, also the institutional structure allows one to convert that education capital into a modern, as Christophe mentioned, why suddenly, you see the huge numbers of the corporate members coming from certain groups in, as is shown in the data, clearly shows there's some sort of caste working as a capital. Second, third, about the sector and caste, definitely it's as I mentioned, it's a double disadvantage for the low caste. One, first you have to go beyond your ascriptive identity, building some educational resources and other forms of resources to move out from your own occupation to a modern occupation. And also you have to fight those who already inherit that modern occupation. So you have a double competition in the when you have a transition from one to the other. So definitely this works in particularly in many industries. That's I'm sure evidence suggests that in the leather industry you have a non-Dalits coming in, but I'm not sure that is possible for others to enter into those domains. So then viable strategy mobility, yeah, again, definitely, as I mentioned earlier, the reservation affirmative action perhaps should be, it should be, strengthened rather than, I don't see that as should be a compromise on that to think of anything beyond that. I'm not saying that's the best solution. If you look at the recent book by Thomas Piketty's Capital and Ideology, it clearly says one level it offered a mobility, but another level it also worked against as a alibi not to provide other forms of support, particularly in access to education and health. So anything on the, the reservation should not be seen as a panacea for all problems. But of course, it has to be complementary, substituted with the other support. Complementary with the other support, not substitute in that sense. And that actually has to go together. So it should, not at the cost of anything. It's affirmative action for selective, for a targeted groups for certain historical reasons, let it be. But you should also think of something in universal which can go along with that. Something, to work out. So it is, in fact, it should be seen as something strategy for any inclusive growth. That's what, for instance, many contexts, you see the voluntary intervention. That's something we need to think of so that sort of intervention. Entrepreneurial pro-Dalit sub-plan. Of course, a sub-component plan, again, it was actually came in, it was there since, I'm talking about the SC sub-component plan. It was there since since 79, if I'm right. And it was actually really worked out in 2006 by the UPA Planning Commission saying that we will actually ensure in each allocation, certain percentage has to go to the Dalits and the Adivasis. So in that say, it is definitely, it should be implemented. It should not be seen as something linked with affirmative action, linked with other policies. It is independent of each other. It is basically asking, it's simply asking bluntly, if you have a government resources, budgeting resources, how much of the budgeting resources should go to the different caste group? That's a straightforward question. I think it's a legitimate demand to ask that share in that budgeting resources. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kalay. I think you've answered everything very comprehensively. We now have a set of questions that both Malini and Bhuvana can take up that are largely to do with planning as an institution and as a project and its relationship to caste as a social structure. So both Vihang Jumle and Mauro Bonavita have asked if there are any instances of planning mechanisms being used to challenge segregation or weaken the social divide in terms of caste, especially given that there seems to be now a sort of conscious effort to provide equal access to spaces in terms of gender. So if there are any instances of planning being used in that sense. Sort of connected to that, Aurel Eschmann, apologies if I'm pronouncing that wrong, from Humboldt University in Berlin asks if caste lens can be useful to study struggles around spatial inequality outside of the South Asian context, to which I would add, what is sort of the conceptual relationship between the planning project as, a colonial project and caste as a social structure, and how do they sort of reinforce each other or not, or if there are any tensions there that can be sort of productive in the struggle in the anti-caste political struggle. So if you want to take that up, Malini, Bhuvana, in any order you want. Yeah.
Okay, I think I'll start. I've been answering several questions in the Q&A box, and I've also put a few resources and answers in the chat box. Thank you so much for all these extremely provocative and important questions. I would like to respond to Christophe's comment very quickly about what I'm thinking of as caste intersectionality, the idea that caste transcends religious borders. And in fact, you see it very much so in Christianity and Islam. Christophe, one of the most startling photographs that I've seen on this question is a Muslim burial ground, where you see a kind of a fence or a kind of cordoned off area for so-called Muslim untouchable bodies that have been buried versus the others, right? So the fact that untouchability is practiced spatially even in death among Muslims is very much a testament to the existence of untouchability, even when people convert from Hinduism to Islam. And this is a topic I'm really learning much more about. And so I would love to continue this conversation. I'm looking forward to logging into the next session when Shireen Azam is going to be talking about caste among Muslims. I also put a reference in the chat box, caste among Muslims, an ethnographic account from a Karnataka village produced by researchers at ISEC, the Institute for Social and Economic Change. So just to say that I think in the colonial era, it wasn't recognized because of the way caste was orientalized among British commentators, right? Even erroneously equated with race, right? And in these very simplistic ways. So the fact that they sort of saw caste as a peculiarly Hindu thing and didn't think about the Mohammedans, right, is one aspect. But also some of these conversions have happened later, right? So in fact, Muslims and poorer caste Muslims, you can trace their conversion to much later periods, right? And conversions from untouchable caste to Islam, but then the stigmas are maintained, the spatial segregation is maintained even with the conversion. So I'll just say that for now. I think it's a very, very pertinent question. So then getting to the analytical and theoretical question, I think, as far as is caste a relevant optic to think about segregation and discrimination beyond South Asia. Some of you might have heard that the African-American scholar Michelle Alexander has just published a book on caste, right? And here she's thinking that caste is actually a global analytic, even to speak about racism in the United States, which is, of course, a very provocative argument, right? And I think this comes back to the Ambedkar quote that Christophe was mentioning earlier about caste being this gradation of laborers. And if you think about sort of the ways in which race is casteized, right, in a context where race is the primary demarker of difference, you can see that the different kinds of laboring occupations, such as frontline workers, domestic help, janitors, et cetera, but there's a particular ways in which race and caste kind of operate together. And so I think it's an interesting and provocative thought. I think one has to be careful about thinking about the specific histories of caste capitalism, racial capitalism, and how they articulate in different contexts. But I do think it's a provocative thought and something that Suraj Yangde has been writing about as well in terms of thinking about global caste. So I'll just say that there. I think I'll turn it over to Bhuva right now and continue to answer some of the questions in the chat. Oh, I do also want to answer a very important question. I think I spoke to it slightly in my opening, but this is the question posed about the kind of, the issues with upper or dominant caste academics trying to study Dalit issues, politics, histories. And I think this is a very, very relevant issue to flag. And I think a lot of Dalit intellectuals have been flagging this. And I think the way I've approached it in my work is precisely to ensure that the centering of the kind of questions that are asked, right? The epistemologies come from the activists and journalists that I'm trying to support, right, through funds, through ensuring that their publications are geared towards the questions that they want to ask if I'm collaborating with them. So that sort of allyship, I think, is very imperative, but I do think we have to be very aware of the risks of appropriation and fight back against that, perhaps take a backseat sometimes when it's really important for Dalit voices to speak up. And I think that's the same conversation happening in the United States right now.
Thanks, Malini. Bhuvana, do you want to maybe take up some of the questions around planning?
Yeah. Thank you, Christophe, for that question on subcaste. Yes, I stand guilty to it. And I think urban studies in general, particularly if you look at the planning literature, it had been pretty silent on the caste question. There's been this sweeping analysis, but you're right that there's the tension between the Mahas and the Chamas are very intense in the settlements that I have studied. And Mahas, in some cases, even in Delhi, some of them managed to move up and get into the government jobs. And they also somehow, in my interaction with some of the students with whom I've worked as part of my Jindal courses, the Maha students always they sometimes tend to perpetuate the same argument the upper caste groups are giving. You know, these people are in this situation because they don't want to improve themselves. And this tension is very much playing out when it comes to eviction and resettlement, as it happened in Katputli colony. You have a group which simply wanted to, particularly the people who were affected by leprosy, they were cured, but yet the community would not accept them, and they were majority of them are from the Chama caste, and they were taking the stand. We don't want to fight eviction. We just want a separate place. We want to move away from the community. If that tension is there, yes, it needs much more analysis on that point. On Swachh Bharat, I feel the problem with Swachh Bharat, or the way planning is done in general, is to projectify every bit. Instead of thinking of the city as a coordinated network infrastructure, what we have done over the years is broken it into specific projects. And if you take Delhi, one is a problem with Swachh Bharat itself, but if you situate Swachh Bharat program within a larger city like Delhi, you take Gurgaon, for example, this is a place that was developed completely by private developers, right? The water supply line, and nobody knows what happens to the drainage that comes out of each building, because each building generates their own electricity, except for the roads that is laid. And even the metro rail is by DLF, that the DLF could contest with the government and say we can have our own municipality. So we reach that absurdity between what is a political institution in Gurgaon. You're introducing Swachh Bharat in a situation where your conventional idea of planning, because if you look at the history of planning, it did come pretty much from the health angle, and water supply and sanitation network are central to it, whether it's Europe or how it got extended to the colonies. However, now with places with the models like Gurgaon or the township models that's coming up, the coordination with the rest of the city is lost. It's like you get spatial enclaves, like social enclaves. Your townships are these new enclaves, and what happens outside the boundary of the township is the city's problem. And people who cannot get entry into the townships are obviously going to bear the risk of the negative externality that's coming. Now, Swachh Bharat thinks and comes from the angle that the manual scavengers community themselves, they do not use the toilet because they are not aware of it. The assumption in itself is erroneous. It's a social engineering program, right? It's stemmed out of it. It is not, they do not use toilet simply because there's no space. And even if they build toilets, where will they go? Now in the settlement that I talked about, because toilet is this visible scene, the toilet seat is the visible sign of their mobility, and that's something that they see as absolutely necessary in their life. And it's a symbol of their, it's something that they see with pride. And that's the first thing that they'll show in the house when you go to them. But they end up collecting everything in the soak pit. And for a settlement that saves the entire city, you wouldn't think about this drainage system itself. Second thing, a lot of the Swachh Bharat program, and in fact, the critique that came from the Dalit groups is that you build toilets without water supply. And obviously, it brings you back to the same group who's doing the waste work, doing the same thing. That makes you raises the same question. Is it that because bodies are available, we take it for granted, and we are very happy with a project that makes no sense to the people that it's supposed to serve? And on the question of caste, whether it is a global analytical thing, I would think yes, because at least if you look at responding to how responding to taking from what Malini said, yes, caste and race are different categories, and one has to be careful with it. And but if you look at the politics, that's the way it is spawning in Tamil Nadu, at least, that the paradox that many of these caste groups get into. Say, for example, there is a community called the Panelists, whom within the untouchables, which other untouchable groups will not even recognize them, will not include them. If you look at the splintering that is happening within them, is it possible to have some device, conceptual device that can unite them? And that's where I thought Tirumavalavan's comment that these are racial categories. Don't think of them as caste, because caste is a creation of the British, and it's basically linked to a particular religion, and it's in fact splintering us much more. And if you look at it as racial categories, then I guess caste can have a global analytical potential. That's one. And is there any planning mechanism to segregate social divide? It depends. Tamil Nadu had an experiment way back when Karunanidhi, when the progressive Dravidian party was in power. And I do acknowledge that the reason that why Tamil Nadu's land got redistributed comes from the Dravidian party, however you look at it today. The ex-Chief Minister Karunanidhi did come up with a project called Samathupuram, and the attempt was to bring different castes together to build a neighborhood where all castes can come together and reside. However, these pretty much depends on the political will, with him moving out and Dravidian parties themselves shifting, having a tectonic shift in terms of what their economic and political interests are. That project still remains as a it remains like any other settlement, because infrastructure is still not extended to it, and you hear the same thing, like it's a issue. And there is one other question that's coming up in the chat, which asks about how does the longevity of residence in the city affect vulnerability to eviction. Yes, earlier it was thought that the second generation and the third generation of migrants will be able to stabilize in the city, but it's no longer true. Because if you look at the types of occupations that are in, one of the occupations that they tend to be in is construction. Because you can join as a laborer, you can move in as a contractor, and you can somehow stabilize yourself. But if you look at the ways in which construction industry itself has changed and where the recruitment practices have changed, it's just the new waves of migrants keep coming and pushing out the earlier settled migrant groups. And to an extent, some of them, from what I know from the Bangalore evidence, is that they try to move into trade, but there are limits to how much you can sustain yourself. That's from the economic end. They are also facing a double whammy, because these are all squatter settlements settled in the center and developed parts of the city, which is now coming under target for urban renewal projects, like the Center City Ward and the wards surrounding the number of the working class neighborhoods, which is again documented by Janaki Nair, a ward called Srirampuram, which is essentially a settlement of textile mill owners and construction workers, are all places now sought for higher end residential redevelopment and the residential redevelopment or mega infrastructure projects. So they are also facing the issue of eviction. Now, if you ask, did they not incrementally get their title? It seems to be paradoxically, whether you have a property title or not, seems to be irrelevant. And this is a case that it's not only in Bangalore, in Chennai. Chennai, for example, through second Madras urban development project, there was a promise of giving title. And they thought they were stable until 2000, when the large scale eviction in the city came in, and they were suddenly told, your papers don't matter. You just have to move, because this project takes primacy. And it depends on how the project is constituted itself, because now you're not fighting just the state. You're fighting a new animal, and you're fighting in this public-private partnership and the kind of institutional forms it takes. It suddenly becomes a public limited company. So there is no way you can, or in other words, it's not no way, but at least the ways in which you can contest it seems harder and harder, right? And so whether you are a settled migrant, or you are a new migrant, or you have papers or not papers, it's immaterial. For example, a recent titling project where the Orissa government is using drone survey, people don't even know what they are surveying and how it is going to be, who's going to get this land, because the Urban Development Authority has already decided that particular land is for a mega infrastructure project, right? And there are people who are on the land, they have paper, but some of them could not do mutation, that is change the name in the register because of various constraints. Now, the Urban Development Authority has asked the Revenue Department to transfer the entire land to them using that mutation as an excuse. And so it's no longer, it's just like the sheet is being pulled from your rugs, right? You don't know what's happening. And with the drone survey, you don't even know how they are parceling the land and to whom they are giving. And particularly the ways in which Urban Development Department and the new institution intervene in land is coming out of a very different logic than the master planning logic or the welfare logic. That's gone. There is not even a semblance or sympathy to welfare kind of agenda. Yeah. And the only thing that they can think of, if you look at the resettlement, is that do resettlement programs. Poor housing, let's resettle them outside the city. The formula is very linear and straightforward. Yeah. And anything else? They push to settle in ecologically. Yeah, I think those are the questions that.
Thank you, Bhuvana. I think we only have a few minutes left, and probably just enough time for a final set of questions. But I just want to pick up on Kabilan's question about the skepticism around Savarna academics studying oppressed communities. And thank you, Malini, for taking that up already. I just want to add to that and say that I think as part of this Confronting Caste series, the idea is very much to shift the focus of critical caste studies from looking at Dalit communities or any particular community as the object of study to looking at structures of power and looking at processes of how that power operates in society. And that shift, I think, is part of this accomplishment and allyship that Malini has been talking about. And the project in this series is very much also to build a critical Savarna consciousness, which I think is quite essential in starting to address and dismantle the structural elements of caste, rather than only looking at the marginalized and sort of their lives and experiences, which has been the focus and which is extremely important, and has been addressed by a majority of caste scholars, but there is also more to be done, and that's definitely the project here. So thank you again for that question. So as a final word, as a final sort of question around political mobilization and fractures within that, we have Ajay Bahu, who has been asking about the place of lower OBCs within similar geographies, and how do we connect that to Dalit movements. We have somebody, Sangharsh Talang, also asking about the role of Dalit movements in shaping governance and planning. So if each of you want to take short 30 seconds to address some of this as a final word, including you, Christophe, then I think that would be a nice note to end the session on. So Malini, do you want to start maybe?
Yeah, I think that some of the research, even including by Christophe, he's really the expert here, has really shown the ways in which OBCs have risen in political power, right, over the last several decades. And I think this is something that there has been scholarship on in terms of the specific politics between OBCs and Dalits. I mean, I think I would only add here, right, is that there's this tendency for academics, as you said, to create a kind of homogenous categories, and there's just so many gradations and so many different types of alliances forming and enmities, and so I think, I mean, this is why field work and detailed research and the kind of quantitative analysis as well that Kalai is doing is just so vital. So I'll just end there, saying that it's really difficult to create like sweeping judgments about the role of OBCs today.
Kalai, Christophe, do one of you want to go next?
Well, I might just say two words. indeed, what we are doing with Kalai and what I did before is to open this box. And in terms of methodology, you see how the ethnographic research and the survey-based research have to go together for this. You can't do without one or the other. You can't generalize without the data. You can't ask a good question to the data if you do not know your society, I mean, the groups. And the last op-ed we did with Kalai on BR was just one more example of that. You know, where are the OBCs in BR? Nowhere. You have so many groups in so many boxes. And the last point I want to make is in reference to what you have just said, Srilata. The project you have initiated is indeed very ambitious in many different senses of the word. And one of the things we are doing, in fact, already, is to ask Dalit scholars to speak about everything and not continue to consider that you come from this group, this is what you can speak about, and this is a continuation of discrimination and stigma by other roads. We need to open that up and we need to forget this, but it's very difficult. And that's why I'm really thankful to you for initiating this.
Thank you, Christophe. That's a very relevant point you make. Appreciate that. Kalai, Bhuvana, any final words from you before we close the session today?
I just say maybe just one word, I guess, for this understanding of the caste. I think I strongly believe the powerful framework that Ambedkar provided. Caste is a graded inequality, like a ascending respect, descending contempt. I mean, if you stick with that frame at any context, how it gets reproduced, I think it's perhaps would help us to constantly think about caste. That's the only when I think about caste, the only framework it gives me is this. The hierarchy structure, the ascending respect, descending contempt. I think that's a powerful frame to think about. Still continues to have, influencing our academic life. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you. I'm nothing much to add. I agree with what Kalai said about caste as a greater inequality.
Thank you so much. I think the time has come to close the session for today, but I just want to take a minute to say some thank yous and acknowledgements. Thank you to our audience, which has been so engaged and thank you for the wonderful questions, for joining us from across continents and time zones. Thank you very much to our panelists and to Christophe for chairing and being discussant. Thank you to Louise Tillin, who I know is here in the audience, who's director of the King's India Institute, for your support and for encouragement. And finally, last but not the least, thank you to Vignesh, who has been the behind the scenes magician who makes everything come together so that we can all be here on your screens talking about all these interesting topics. So thank you everyone for joining us. We'll be back in 2 weeks on 26th of November with another panel event on faith, religion, and anti-caste politics. So keep an eye on our social media handles, keep an eye on our website. Tomorrow, our first podcast episode is going to go live, and we'll be sending you emails when the YouTube video goes live as well of this recorded session. So thank you again to everybody. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you back again in 2 weeks' time.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.